The anime gave a lot more credit to Goto than it should've, where here they portrayed him as close to Sung's equal. In the manhwa and novels, Sung straight up traumatized him. So, as awesome as it was to watch Sung throw hands with Japan's #1 hunter, that was a very important detail left out from it. It was a terrifying experience that went to affect Goto greatly. This influences his actions later on, as well as places a wedge in his overall plans with Matsumoto. It's only part of the cut content we're gonna talk about though, since quite a bit more was left out to bring us the raid as fast as possible. So, just as we do every week, here's all those extra details and scenes to make your solo leveling experience a more complete one. I'm just gonna shout out the new solo leveling shirts one more time though, since by the end of next week they're gonna be gone for good. That's right, now and next video are the last chances you'll have to buy one of the 3 designs the team and I cooked up together. As shirts that are sourced locally then made in-house, I promise this is some of the highest quality streetwear you can get your hands on. So, whether it's Iron's shield, Igris' sword, or Sung's daggers, you can sport this subtle nod to solo leveling pretty much anywhere. Just click the link down in the description to check them out. But anyway, episode 22, We Need a Hero, covering chapters 91 to 96 from the manhwa and chapters 112 to 115 from the web novel. Let's start things off here in the gymnasium, where Goto would be incredibly bored watching Korea's best spar. In the manhwa, he was a lot more polite, but in the novel, he genuinely found them pitiful. The word laughable came to mind despite him not trying to be too mean about it. It was a thought that confirmed his belief that Korea's protection would be in far better hands with the Japanese. Cha was the only hunter he deemed somewhat worthwhile, but even then, her abilities paled in comparison to Japan's best. So, Goto just found it unlucky the one who awakened with the most potential also turned out to be an old man who couldn't fight anymore. Chairman Go was the only S-rank Goto could consider as their equal. It was once that assessment was made that Goto found no reason to stick around anymore. He had visually confirmed their plan could proceed without issue now. At least that was until he saw Sung. He actually didn't notice him until he was already in the room, so that's why Goto assumed Sung was an assassin type. In fact, despite Sung's aura being very much visible, Goto couldn't sense anything at all from him. So, to hear he was actually a mage type hunter, well, that came as quite the shock for him. It was so unbelievable that he needed to take out his phone and verify it on the Hunter Association's website. In the novel, this would be the moment when Goto challenges Sung, but in the manhwa there were first a few interactions with the Japan hunters. Kei could barely talk due to the repugnant smell, but he did find Cha to be pretty interesting. Since she only blocked her nose using a handkerchief though, that made him think she was significantly weaker than him. Hanekawa's assessment was pretty much the same as Goto's, so when she was talking trash in Japanese, Jong-soo, who understood her, immediately stepped in to correct her. This would lead to a back and forth of mostly pettiness, since Hanekawa would question Jong-soo's presence as a measly A-rank, while Jong-soo would swing back calling her just the interpreter. Turns out she's actually an A-rank hunter herself, and Jong-soo's comment would be enough to get her to want to fight. Despite Goto's best efforts to keep things courteous, Hanekawa would insist Jong-soo take her on in a 1v1. This was how the grab the wrist game came to be, since Jong-soo would be the one to come up with the rules for it. It was a good way to measure each other's abilities beyond just brute force. He had found a way to include tactics as well. So, Jong-soo would take a ready stance Hanekawa didn't find appropriate, but when asked why it was he chose it, Jong-soo would simply say his hands were only coming out to grab her wrist. Initially, that gave the impression Jong-soo was confident in his speed, but what it really was confidence in fighting other people. So, the match would proceed without Jong-soo taking a single hit, minus a hit to his pride when this happened. Hanekawa would then take this as an opportunity to strike, but committing so fully had left her open as well. It was the exact moment Jong-soo was waiting for. With Hanekawa focused only on offense and forgetting about defense, Jong-soo was able to grab her wrist without her even realizing what had happened. It was a feat he was able to pull off solely from his experience fighting other people. So, where in Japan Hanekawa likely only fought monsters, in Korea fighting other hunters wasn't as uncommon as she might think. That being the case, Jong-soo had a lot more experience predicting the movements of people. It was a stark contrast from the easily readable moves of monsters. A massive gap in experience that resulted in Jong-soo's victory. It was after that Goto would suggest the 4v4, masking it as a means to build trust, but what it really was to see in person just how strong everyone was. The rules were expanded to exclude assassin and mage type hunters, then in addition to the wrist, a person could win by touching their opponent's back or knocking them down. So Kenzo was calm knowing Beck and Ma were probably weaker than him, but he did suspect that Beck was hiding something. Lim was hoping Japan would go easy on him, but with him being a ranger capable of attacking multiple people at once, that changed the 1v1 dynamic into a bona fide group match. So, if Japan wanted to keep the matchups limited to one person only, it was pretty essential to take him out first. Now, it was during the fight that Chairman Go would be in awe of how they were able to destroy the gym, but seeing their power reminded him of how much of a shame it was to be sending such young hunters to the battlefield. Atsushi lived by the rule of survival of the fittest, up to the point when he had to prove that he was the fittest. What I mean is that despite going at Beck with the intent to kill, he would hesitate at the very last second just like how he always did. It was a common occurrence that indicated the hunter lifestyle wasn't really for him. This made Beck reconsider his previous thought that every hunter wanted to fight, and it led him to call Atsushi a coward. To him, it was a shame that one of the strongest S ranks present was someone incapable of fighting. The fights would then continue just as we saw, except for a bit more context on what happened here. When enraged like this, Atsushi turns into a completely different person. He loses all sense of rational thinking, and by the end can't even remember what happened during it. It was a crazy shift in mentality that, when active, enabled him to clear a B rank gate all by himself. Consider it a kind of berserk mode that put everyone around him at risk. Why then was he part of a strike squad? Well, my guess would be for that wildcard factor. He was a coward in his normal state and unpredictable when enraged. So, it was this enhanced power that allowed him to gain the upper hand on Shaw, leaving Sung no choice but to intervene. The anime wasn't entirely clear about that, but in the manhwa she was on the floor about to get pummeled. This brings us back to the 1v1, which in the novel was mostly necessary, but was also partly for pride too. You see, while Goto's mission did require him to learn everything he could about Sung, he also wanted to lift the mask Sung was hiding behind. He refused to accept that this new S-rank hunter was a mage, so in order to eliminate any unexpected variations and prove he was right, Goto decided to get more data on Sung. He suggested a friendly spar masqueraded as training, but Sung instantly knew exactly what it was. It didn't take a genius to realize this, since had Goto just wanted to show off, then he would have just done so against Choi or Beck. It's because he asked him that Sung knew he was the target. Sung's smile after was the outcome Goto least expected, since it's not every day someone seems so eager to face him. Normally they'd be hesitant or flustered, but here Sung's expression could be perceived multiple different ways. Was he perhaps confident, or was it a nervous reaction due to how troublesome the situation was? Either way, seeing Hanekawa get more nervous the more the conversation proceeded led Goto to think something interesting was happening. What should have just been a simple yes or no instead became a lengthy talk Hanekawa clearly lost control over. The result being an additional condition that flipped the tables on Goto. So, where Sung was the one who should have been caught off guard, now it was only Goto who was flustered. It was news that left him genuinely pissed. Like, before he was just gonna take things easy then withdraw, but now he knew he'd have to try. Luckily, Shimizu was available on standby, so as an S-rank healer herself, any damage done would be healed immediately. So Goto had told her to get ready to heal Sung. To him, he was the only one who'd be needing it. Now, the reason Cha wanted to step in was because she fully believed Sung was in over his head. As someone who saved her guildmates from certain death, she didn't think it right to let him get hurt from a spar she initially didn't think he had a chance of winning. When she remembered the stare Sung gave her back in the dungeon though, a great sense of anticipation rose within her. She wanted to see Sung fight just as much as Beck did. Such a fight was one anyone lower than the S rank would have to stand far away from, because when it came to a battle such as this, those weaker could easily die simply from being too close. It was when the fight actually started that Goto's opener was intended to end the fight instantly. Since Sung damaged his pride with his condition, this was the fastest way to regain it. Unfortunately, his plan failed just as quick, but at the very least, Sung's evasion of the attack made it clear he wasn't a mage-type hunter. Goto still didn't know what it was the Korean Hunter Association was trying to hide, but his job of determining Sung's abilities was now one step closer to completion. The next steps were to peel back all the layers Sung was hiding behind that, an objective that would have him continue a relentless pursuit until all Sung was capable of was revealed to him. Now, while Goto was very clearly stronger than all the other S ranks present, the emotion Sung felt while fighting him was belief in himself. Since he could finally recognize exactly how strong he'd become, seeing this new power gave him incredible confidence. It was Goto's inability to hit Sung that led him to start going all out, so naturally everyone was surprised Sung was able to keep up with him. What they all perceived as Sung hanging in there, though, was something else entirely that only Cha realized. You see, where everyone else saw Sung being led around by Goto's endless stream of attacks, Cha could clearly tell it was the opposite. The way Sung moved indicated he was in full control. So, just like a puppet master pulling all the strings, Sung was managing the battle's flow in a way that left Goto no choice but to keep attacking. If Cha's assumptions were correct, then Sung was matching Goto's pace in order to get a read on him. It was a feat only possible if his own level was several times greater than Goto's, the only logical conclusion given what was being displayed right now. This then reinforced the notion the fight needed to be ended since Sung wasn't the one who was in danger anymore. No, all the risk lay solely with Goto now. For Beck, who was watching with his eyes of the beast, his assumption that Sung could grow stronger was finally confirmed here. In comparison to the power he witnessed back at the association building, once again Sung's was now incomparably greater. So Beck's entire body trembled as he knew with certainty growing stronger was a possibility. Now, Goto was well aware Sung suckered him into a battle of his own pace, so to be called the strongest yet now be so outmatched here, well, that felt like his pride was getting destroyed piece by piece. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore, so what started out as training now became a full-on duel with the intent to kill. Sung picked up on this almost instantly, and shortly after came a warning from the system. Should Goto continue the way he was, then Sung had no doubt an emergency quest would be issued. And it was then that he'd be left with no choice but to kill Goto. So, in order to prevent such a precarious situation from unfolding, Sung knew he'd finally have to get involved. It's the reason he decided to catch Goto's hand here. It wasn't because Goto had any sort of advantage, it was simply because Sung didn't want to be forced to kill him. Goto, on the other hand, had every intention of taking Sung's eye out here, and that was an attack that went beyond just training anymore. So, unless Sung had stopped the battle right where it was, the system definitely would have intervened instead. The thing is, now the atmosphere was incredibly different. Everyone could sense this ominous chill, but the one who felt it most was Goto. In fact, his body instinctively responded in a way it never had before, while his head was stuck still trying to understand it. As a feeling he'd gone his entire life without experiencing, these chilling goosebumps left him perplexed, then suddenly anxious. It was as his brain continued to process the fact his attack was stopped that Goto would try to pull away. He would yank his arm with all his might, but Sung's absurd strength ensured he could go nowhere. That's when Goto would see Sung's ice-cold glare, along with the tightly clenched fist cocked back taking aim right at his unguarded face. And just as Morgan Freeman once said before,
"It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up."
That's right. After coming to see this as the grave mistake that it was, a single word was all that popped into his head. Death was the only thing he could think about now. He couldn't understand why that was, but seeing the attack waiting for him made him feel that that might have been the outcome had he unleashed it. So it's for that reason Beck and Cha saw the need to jump in. They definitely could have been injured had Sung continued with what he was planning, but considering the risk presented to Goto, it was definitely worse to have the leader of the Japanese team succumb to injury or death. The fallout for it would have been cataclysmic, especially since the raid was only days away now. So, unlike how it was in the anime, there was never any risk to Sung at all. Not only that, but Goto would come out this fight fearing for his life. Having experienced a near-death call that was completely unknown to him, this would send him down a spiral from which he would never recover from. It's for that reason I think such a detail is important, because an outcome like that changes pretty much everything for Goto. In fact, when Goto went to compose himself after the fight, not only was a cold sweat persisting all over his body, but his hands were also bruised black and blue from how tight Sung grabbed him. It's then he would call Matsumoto to inform him changes needed to be made, but with Sung not being on the raid list at all, Matsumoto assured him there was nothing to worry about. It was absurd news that was shocking to say the least. Now, for all the other S-ranks who witnessed this fight, only Beck and Cha knew how outmatched Goto was. Every guildmaster would still try to recruit Sung after, but Beck alone would stand to the side knowing it wasn't possible. It was clear Sung was the most valuable hunter in existence, so to think he'd join a guild was just absurd. Luckily, he did have a plan B, and that was to maintain a relationship with him in a different way. So, Guildmaster Ma would comment how Sung was the perfect complement to his guild since with so many mages making up the ranks from his, having a fighter was sure to balance that. That's when Choi would mention he was a mage type, and that would shock Ma just as much as it shocked Goto. In any case, with the meetup done and the raid only a day away, every news outlet was covering it non-stop. This was only in Korea though, as not much was being said about it from the Japanese side. Not a single station was covering the united front Japan had made with Korea there. It was when the occasional article did make its appearance online that the comments would usually be filled with hate towards Korea. It was two drastically different reactions to what was ultimately the same event. To focus specifically on the news in Korea, aside from the Ants' evolution being presented as the primary reason for the raid even happening, TV panelists would commend Min for coming out of retirement, while the online discourse would question Sung's absence. Those questions also came with a fair number of hate comments, since without any reason to justify his absence, they could only assume he was the same cowardly E-rank he always was. When it came to how Sung really felt though, comments like these meant nothing at all. Reason being that the only people he was concerned with were back at home. In the novel, that mentality was pretty much the same, but though these past few days were some of his happiest, he really didn't want to miss out on the Jeju raid. His heart raced every time he thought about all the XP he could get. It was when he set that aside and calmly analyzed what was really at stake that it became abundantly clear he couldn't leave his mom like that. I mean, she wasn't even aware he was a hunter yet. So, whenever he thought of telling her, then explaining how he was participating in the most dangerous raid the country has ever faced, well, that just brought back memories of all those sleepless nights his mom had back when their dad went missing. So, it's for that reason Sung couldn't do it. He couldn't have his mom relive those painful memories all over again. If there was one thing more precious to him than XP, it was the family he fought so hard to protect in the first place. The hate comments were something Jinna was more prone to reading, so if Sung had to be worried about something, it was pretty much how those might affect her. Other than that, Sung had no problem letting Korea and Japan duke things out on their own. So it was then that he would receive a call from Jinho, leading us to a scene I suspect will be in next episode. It also segues into a scene with the serial killer I mentioned a few episodes before, but that's something they probably won't include either. Either way, I'll still wait till next episode just in case. Switching over to the scene with the Ant Queen, in the manhwa there were several orders she constantly ingrained into the Super Ant. The first was to make the enemies who stand in their way tremble in fear, the second was to become ever stronger, then the third was to consume all there was to consume. This would be the 3 rules this Super Ant would abide by. Now, for Goto, who was prepping himself in the meantime, he was still trembling from his face-off against Sung. In the manhwa, Sung's grip would still be imprinted into his hand, reminding him of that all too uncomfortable feeling he experienced. He felt he was being just a little oversensitive. In the novel, Goto goes about dealing with this a different way, since here he would choose a more robust approach. He would be training inside the dojo of the Japanese Hunter Association, facing off against 3 S-rank hunters all at the same time. It was after easily incapacitating all 3 of them that Goto would confirm nothing was wrong with him. In fact, he had actually held himself back, since by not doing so he would have injured these S-ranks. So, as far as he was concerned, there was absolutely nothing wrong with his physical condition. The same unfortunately couldn't be said for his mental condition. For a reason completely unknown to him, Goto found himself haunted by this feeling of uneasiness. He definitely had a hunch of where it was coming from, but all he could do now was try to ignore it. Since once the raid was over, Sung's presence wouldn't matter, Goto assumed this feeling would be something he'd never have to deal with again. This brings us now to the day of the raid, where a lot more context would be given about the cameraman. Long story short, His boss had spent half the annual budget to secure exclusive rights to record this, pinning the entire station's future solely on him. Why was the price so high? Well, an S-rank gate wasn't something someone could record anytime they wanted. They were already incredibly rare to begin with, then considering how electronics didn't work inside the gate, that meant to get footage one would have to wait for the even more rare occurrence of an S-rank dungeon break. So, given that this was exactly that, this raid could very well be the only time the world could ever get to witness an event like this. That made the exorbitant price seem like it was nothing, since when considering the money to be made by selling the footage to other networks, the station's manager knew they'd come out rich. The only risk was whether or not the cameraman would return alive, something that was highly dependent on the raid's success. Of course, no regular cameraman would willingly throw themselves into that, which is why the station's director was ready to beg him to. Such an act wasn't necessary though, since the cameraman assured him there was nothing to worry about. He knew this was easily the biggest job of his life, and that wasn't something he was gonna pass up on. As one of the awakened who chose to live a normal life, he decided long ago to use his powers as a hunter to further his profession as a cameraman. He definitely didn't like raids or the fights that came along with it, but if being a hunter allowed him to get footage others couldn't, that was an opportunity he couldn't let waste. He essentially decided to use his secondary profession to further his primary one. Now, normally the chairman wouldn't have let any TV station film this, but considering what was at stake, Mr. Go deemed it necessary. After 3 disappointing failures, the public needed to know they could still trust the Hunter Association. He couldn't let the sentiment of powerlessness continue to linger across the country. So, with this raid having the highest chance of succeeding, Chairman Go allowed this broadcast solely with the intent to change that sentiment. In any case, anxiety couldn't even begin to describe what these S-rank hunters were feeling. Min's presence did provide quite a bit of relief though, since having an S-rank healer meant they could go as hard as they wanted to now. So long as he was present, he could easily heal them to perfect shape at the end of every fight. Mistakes were no longer as costly now. But yeah, that's pretty much everything from before the raid. I'll get into the actual raid next video, along with those extra details with Jinho I mentioned earlier. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see that, and if you want to support the channel a little more, feel free to check out the new teas down below. The link to that is down in the description. But anyway, until next time, ciao.